The Russian army is slowly but surely moving forward. Ukraine is losing village by village, and the end and the edge of the Russian offensive is not visible. Putin demonstrates the ability to fight on equal terms with the NATO bloc and the entire Western world. Russia is returning the status of superpower, and it is impossible to stop it neither in Ukraine nor anywhere else. Therefore, it is necessary to reconcile under the conditions of Putin and normalize relations. These words are regularly heard from Russian ethnics, including the laypeople and the liberal skin, and from supposedly serious commentators in the West, often for conservative purposes. But in fact, this is nothing more than a fantasy. Each fairy tale, including the collapse of the liberal world order, needs a hero, and many are trying to look for him in the figure of Vladimir Putin. However, these fairy tales have nothing in common with reality. The promotion of the Russian army on the big map is difficult to see with the unarmed eye. They are at the expense of huge losses and growing negative trends in the economy. Russia is throwing the last resources into the same meat grinder in Ukraine and doesn't notice the hard-earned influence on the post-Soviet space and the long term. We'll talk about it in today's video. Moreover, it's not just my opinion and my analysis, but the position in the Western and American media, even in the favorite newspaper of Donald Trump, is becoming mainstream. In almost every report, I show you maps on which Russian promotion can look very threatening without context. But as the Project Ukraine Control map writes, such maps have too big an approximation. We forget how the Russian war against Ukraine looks at the strategic level, but it looks like this. The authors of the project decided to remind about it, bringing the map of the entire Ukraine. The pale red line on it is the front line on December 22, after the last successful Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kherson. The bright red line is the current contact line. To see the territory captured by Russia on it, you will have to look with a magnifying glass. In numbers, this also looks quite clear. In 2023, in the last 3 months, Russia captured 148 km of Ukrainian territory. In 2024, more than 2,800 km. In the first half of 2025, 1,829 km. You can find an excuse for alarmism, say the Russian offensive accelerated in 2024 in a count of 12 months about 5 times and in 2025 about 30%. But let's go up to a higher level again. The total area of Ukraine is 603,000 square kilometers. At the end of the autumn of 2023, 109,000 square kilometers were occupied, that is, about 18%. During this time, that is, almost 2 years, Russia captured another 4,800 square kilometers, that is, about 0.8% of the territory of Ukraine. Even if Russian armed forces will move forward with the pace that it managed to achieve in May-June of this year, in the course of the Russian summer offensive, it will take more than 80 years to capture the entire territory of Ukraine. It is clear that direct extrapolation is a matter of dead and manipulative, but firstly, it works in both directions, and secondly, in principle, it helps to understand the scale of the subject that we are talking about. Someone may object that Russia is waging a war not for the territory, but for exhaustion in the hope that the Ukrainian army will end earlier than the Russian one, and therefore, it is not necessary to advance quickly at all. This narrative is actually more than 100 years old. During the First World War, generals from both sides tried to explain to the political leadership why the front moves a maximum of a couple of tens of kilometers back and forth. After the German failed the attack on Verdun, the Germans came up with the term Ausblutung or Ausblutung, bloodletting. The French, after their own failed operations, grinned with disgust. Sorry for my French and German, it's no good. The point was the same. Thanks to our attack, the enemy's army will be a little exhausted, and then we will go on a triumphant march to Berlin or Paris. However, the successes on the Western Front were achieved not when one side ran out of soldiers, but when, thanks to the improvement of the tactics of assault groups, artillery and general military combat, cooperation of all forces and funds, first to the Germans and then to the Allies, it was possible to break through the front and start an unprecedented offensive operation on the Western Front. The depth of tens or even hundreds of kilometers. Russia has not yet come up with a similar tactic for the war of the 21st century, and the assault company of the Russian armed forces is not an elite, but an analog of Stalin's penal battalions only on the scale of the entire army. On the other hand, there is already a term, multiple. Well, so what? We are not moving faster, but we are destroying the enemy. But first of all, the multiple is a stick at both ends. Ukraine consciously takes this strategy for arms, putting a bar in 30,000 killed per month, which is hoped to achieve what I talked about in my video about the line of drones. And they are already at least halfway through, and then 2/3 have passed, destroying 15,000 to 20,000 Russians every month. I talked in detail in a recent video about the Russian offensive with its unprecedented loss. Moreover, in the defense forces, which are already experiencing a chronic lack of personnel, the tendency to replace people is expanding with drones, including ground-based robots in logistics, evacuation, and more often on the battlefield. I also talked about this in a video about the war of the future, which is coming before our eyes. Of course, Western partners of Ukraine will be ready to invest in the production of ground-based robotic systems, especially if it means that in the future they will not have to fight their own living soldiers in the fields and in the cities of Europe. Therefore, the Russian evacuation strategy has far less prospects than it seems at first glance. But the fact is that Russia, as a country that participates in the World War I, does not conduct a pure war on evacuation. And the sides also tried to break through the enemy's front for more than 3 years, writing off the failures of bite and bloodshed, and now Russia is doing the same, but in a completely different way, taking into account the new conditions created on the battlefield. In May, the analyst Clement Malin wrote that the Russian army does not conduct a pure war on evacuation. Yes, Ukrainian defense is constantly being tried to evade with the help of airstrikes, artillery, and drones. But this is done in order to break through the front and achieve operational success, which will soon, like 2 years, slip away from the Russian command. From the point of view of war on evacuation, the sending of the enemy to the position of the endless mechanized columns, which we observed in the 23rd year and during most of the 24th, looks absolutely pointless. And sometimes we continue to observe to this day. The only meaning of this tactic, which sometimes still works, is to have time to bring the infantry to the Ukrainian positions and clear them, having advanced a few more kilometers, so that it was possible to draw an arrow and paint a piece of the map. Only the Russian army is exhausted here, and in fact, this has already happened. Russians almost everywhere refuse to use the equipment, first moving to the tactics of motor assaults. When Russian soldiers on motorcycles are trying to rapidly skip the kill zone of the Ukrainian drones and artillery again to get to the Ukrainian positions and take them by storm. In such attacks, the Russian army consciously exhausts itself. Everything is for the sake of leader promotion. Lately, the Russian tactics have been led by the constant sending of small groups of infantry to the death, which must sink through the rifts in Ukrainian defense and secure themselves, although most of them die from Ukrainian fire. The analysts of the Deep State Project described this tactic as follows. Lately, the same situations occur at different parts of the front as on the image in this post. The enemy not only puts pressure on the positions of Ukrainian fighters with small groups, it also leaves the task of penetrating as deep as possible into the rear, hiding and trying to survive to secure themselves for the arrival of a new group. But in most cases, infantrymen or their small group who manage to break through to the rear stay there forever. Drone operators or artillery try to eliminate the enemy immediately. Such attempts by Russian armed forces give them an advantage in promotion, because in this way they spread the power of attention aimed at identifying and destroying these groups. At the same time, the Russians are deliberately going to die in such assault actions. The problem is also the catastrophic lack of people in defense, for which it is not possible to close holes in positions in time. It is through them that the Russian military moves to the rear. This description, as it should be, conveys the strategy of the offensive for the sake of the offensive, which has nothing in common with the war on exhaustion, and it already brings its negative fruits for Russia. As I said in a recent video, Russian losses in recent months are breaking all records. According to the authoritative assessment of the economy, they are 10-20,000 per month only killed. There is literally not enough space on the monuments of the dead fighters, and it is necessary to install new slabs, silent witnesses of the mass sacrifice by the crazy ambitions of Putin. Every captured square kilometer is bypassed by Russia in 3 dozen lives of soldiers. It is not difficult to count that when trying to capture the whole of Ukraine, the bill will go to millions of dead and crippled. These losses in addition also take away the hard-working population from the Russian economy, which is already going through bad times. At the top, they diplomatically talk about the cooling of the Russian economy, which means that boom, caused by the influx of huge money to the VPC and payments to the fighters, goes to nothing, leaving behind inflation and the lack of investment in infrastructure, healthcare, and everything else necessary for the normal functioning of the country. The fact is that a healthy economic growth is an investment in the production of competitive goods, and not only the ones that drive, fly, and explode. State funds, on the other hand, go literally to the grave. As the pro-Russia read, the costs only for providing Putin's meat grinder with fresh meat in the first half of 2025 will be 2% of GDP. Here are the payments at the end of the contract, the salary of the servicemen with the front add-ons, and the payments for the injuries of the coffin. It would seem that such payments should stimulate demand, but firstly, a significant part of them the fighters themselves spend on drones, means of transport, and similar products. That is, in fact, there is a shadow replenishment of the military budget. And secondly, even this does not help in Western pro-Ukrainian circles and social networks. I like to joke about the fact that the death of a fighter brings a new lauda to the dissatisfied family, but in fact, Avtovaz reduced production due to the collapse of the auto market, caused by the expensive auto loans. In the first half of the year, the sales of cars in Russia fell by 26% compared to the same period of 1924. And this despite the fact that the rental vehicles are massively driven to the front instead of the finished BMP and BTR. There are many such examples, and we regularly analyze them in the resurrectionary economic reports. But the main conclusion is that the Russian economy turned out to be the same colossus on clay feet as the Russian army. The faking of Putin's superpower is slowly beginning to be realized in the West, and in the most unexpected circles. For example, this material has released the New York Post, which is considered Trump's favorite newspaper. Citing the beginning of the material so that you can roughly understand its tone, the president of Russia said that there will be no economic decline. Like a villain from comics, melodramatic and detached from reality, Putin seems to be sure that it is enough to say something out loud to make it true. But uncontrollable inflation, which he is trying to ignore, does not give way. By collecting, it empties the store and puts hard time on family budgets. Putin's superpowers are as real as the state he controls. The helplessness of Moscow is obvious to everyone. Who is ready to see the truth? 11 years after the beginning of the crusade against the neighbor, which is a quarter smaller in size, Russia controls less Ukrainian territory than in 1922, and its latest tactics, terror against the civilians, can only be described as a tyrant hysteria. According to the New York Post, Putin, being unable to capture Ukraine, puts evil on Ukrainian civilians. The newspaper gives an example of the story. The old boy Dima from Kherson, who was killed by the Russian drone operator. People always clearly see where they aim. So the death of Dima cannot be explained by the hit by a shell. On July 11, the newspaper came out with a photo of Dima on the front line. A wonderful act that could affect the decision of Trump to strengthen the help of Ukraine in a row. With the appointment of Milan's wife and European leaders, in the conditions of war against humanity, such a press, which finds the strength not to hide its neutrality but to speak the truth, is indispensable. Here you can remember the reportage of the American journalist Edward Murrow from under the Hitler's bombings in London, who, by the way, were also hysterical and dictatorial, who in the course of the battle for England could not break the resistance of the British VVS. Then the Murrow reportage became one of the factors that tilted the American public opinion to the need for the help of Great Britain, who fought one-on-one against Hitler. And now its heirs convince the Americans that Ukraine deserves their help, telling about the safaris of people in Kherson and other cities of Ukraine. But the main thing in the New York Post material is not a description of Putin's bloody hysterics, but the fact that Russia is actually weak and it can be defeated. Some will say, they continue to quote the material, "Ukraine is holding on because we are helping," the article says. But how much do we really help? A drop of help here is a batch of ammunition. There are delays, disputes, and in a deformed form. In general, America has spent less than 1% of its federal budget on helping the bravest people on Earth. If this fragile drop holds the army of Russia, then this does not mean our strength, but the weakness of Moscow. Russia considers itself a superpower, but a real superpower would not go to the dead end, only because someone beyond the ocean is hardly helping Kiev, trying not to humiliate Moscow. Ukraine does not hold our help, it is held by the people who know what they are fighting for, unlike the cruel colonizer who does not know. The topic of Russia as a dutiful superpower goes through the entire article. Putin cannot control not only Ukraine, but also the price of potatoes, which grew into 3 in a year. Only one example is very close to Americans, who recently experienced a serious rise in food prices, which also influenced the election of President Trump. Moreover, Russia, which tried to deprive Ukraine of sovereignty, in fact was deprived of independence itself. The production of drones that fly to Ukrainian cities is practically entirely dependent on China. 92% of foreign components have Chinese origin. The article refers to the Financial Times from 1923. It was reported then that Xi Jinping almost directly forbade his vassal to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Confidence of Russia's nuclear threat depends on the observer's perception, that is, us. This phrase is said in the article. In general, it is necessary to write on the board 100 times in all Western centers of decision-making, like Bart Simpson in the meme scene from the beginning of each episode. Moreover, the New York Post notes another obvious fact. Russia is forced to question drones, artillery, and missiles from the state of SGOI, like North Korea and Iran. This does not fit with the form of a superpower that Putin is trying to impose. If Hitler had to ask for ammunition from Italy or, let's say, from Franco-Hispania, he would probably be cut off by YouTube by shame, not in May 1945, but a couple of years earlier. But this is the reality of Russian superpowers. And apparently this must be said again to recognize. The article, of course, mentions the colossal military losses that this year reached millions of killed and wounded. The level of superpowers has reached the point that Russia is forced to hide its demographic statistics. And it's not only about excessive mortality during the war, but also about the decline of the birth rate. This is important because the birth rate is the sacred cow of Western conservatives. For example, if you read Elon Musk's Twitter, you'll see that the birth rate of Western countries is below the level of reproduction of the population. And there's nothing to boast about in Russia. Although many conservatives consider Russia to be a kind of Mecca, and those who are particularly cold-hearted come here to die. It's not clear why. It is enough to recall the story of Derek Huffman, who fled Russia from the gender ideology and went to the Russian army to get citizenship for himself and his family. After that, he was immediately sent to the front, despite the seemingly useful civilian profession of a welder. He was promised that he would not go to the front, but he, of course, was eventually sent there. So, the New York Post debunked the conservative myth of Russia with the help of simple statistical data. But before we move on, I will remind you that you can support this video with your likes, comments, and subscriptions to the channel. All these actions help promote it, especially your subscriptions, so do not forget to click on it. You can also support the channel. You can do it on Patreon, the link is in the description. And by buying NVPN, which allows you to watch YouTube at normal speed, use Twitter, use Instagram, go to blocked resources. In general, the state should not decide what to watch, listen, and read, only you can do it. You can do it with the help of NVPN, buying it by the link in the description, and thereby you will also support this channel. But we move on. What kind of data does New York Post provide to dispel the myth of Russian conservatism in the American understanding? In Russia, they write, one of the highest divorce rates in the world, 60% higher than in the United States. The abortion rate of more than 2 people exceeds the same rate in Ukraine. Only about 1% of the population attended Christmas services last year, they write. In Ukraine, by the way, in 2023, 10 million people came to the temple. Christmas was first celebrated on December 25, according to the Julian calendar. How many people live in Ukraine now is hard to estimate, but in any case, the figure is tens of percent. But the statistical data in the article does not end there. The newspaper recalls that there can be no equal confrontation between Russia and the West, and Putin has not yet lost only because the West has not actually appeared at war. They write that half of the world's domestic product, the share of Russia, is less than 2%. This is not a superpower, but just a vanishing empire that creates hysteria. But its invasion in Ukraine is quite real, like a rocket that kills innocent children in a dream. Again, only because the West allows it to do so. I hope the article convinced at least someone that it's time to put an end to this, especially since all the possibilities for this are there. Only political will is needed. What the end is really coming to now is even the external elements of Russian superpowers. Russia is losing influence in the so-called Middle East and the Far East as well, first of all, in the Middle East. Last and most striking example is the agreement on the Zangezur corridor, which passes through the territory of Armenia and connects the main territory of Azerbaijan with the Nacke exclave. The agreement on the transfer of the corridor to the long-term rent of the United States was adopted with the participation of Armenia, Azerbaijan, Turkey, and the United States. Russia was simply not invited to the negotiations, which, as it were, better demonstrates the loss of influence in the West Caucasus. Especially if we remember how 5 years ago the Pashinyan and Aliyev went on a visit to Putin in Azerbaijan. Despite a sure victory under Russian pressure, he refused to restore full control over Karabakh. 2023, Aliyev completed the mission. The operation continued for literally 1 day, and already then Russia was helpless. The peacekeepers of the Russian Federation, with shame, retired, and the Azerbaijan troops entered in Stepnikert, which since then has not been called otherwise as a historical Azerbaijani name, Hankendi. I gave an assessment of this event separately, but today it is not about this and not about the dictatorship of Aliyev, but about Putin and Russia. And this is just one example of the loss of at least a formal status of Russia, not just a superpower, but at least a regional hegemon. Good material about this was written in Washington Post by the head of the Moscow Bureau of Publishing, Robin Dixon. According to him, Western analysts believe that the full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine is a huge strategic mistake, which turned from the loss of not only international influence, but also, for example, the traditional markets of energy users. Russian gas for decades was a serious geopolitical lever of pressure on Ukraine and all of Europe, which prevented the development of strategic gas pipeline projects such as the famous Nord Stream, which recently finally died after the introduction of European sanctions, which directly prohibit any investment in this gas pipeline. Moreover, it was the war with Ukraine that led to Putin losing his most important ally, friend, and admirer, Donald Trump. I told you about how exactly this happened in one of my videos, but to be brief, Trump was hoping to settle the deal with Putin by announcing big concessions like frostbite along the front line and guaranteeing Ukraine's entry into NATO. The US president believed that his Russian colleagues would stop the pointless war and nothing would hinder them from Trump's friendship and cooperation in the international arena. But over and over again, emotional and telephone conversations turned into more bloody attacks on the cities of Ukraine. And Trump finally took the news of European partners, his wife Melania and New York Post newspaper and accepted the simple truth that Putin does not want peace because he has moved forward in this war and that it is impossible to trust his promises. Therefore, the only way to achieve peace is through force, although not as direct as Trump demonstrated in the course of strikes on Iran. The US was not a president as much as it was so inclined to Russia and modern-day Clinton, who was ready to forgive Yeltsin in Chechnya and shoot the White House just so that the communists would not come to power again and would not restore the USSR. In this historical chance, Putin shot with a crack, turning Trump from an ally into an enemy. An expert on Russia, professor of the American Catholic University Michael Kimmich, says that Putin is not as concerned about the expansion of NATO as much as the desire to punish Ukraine for the fact that it did not accept the role of an obedient vassal, like Belarus. This is deeply and rationally, even fanatically, but precisely for this and many other reasons, I believe that Putin simply cannot break away from this war, said Kimmich in a Washington Post comment. It was precisely as a result of the war that the very expansion of NATO took place, which included Sweden and Finland, who had been driving this idea away for many years. This idea was unpopular in these countries. In addition, the countries of the bloc took the responsibility to expand military spending to 5% of GDP. Moreover, the military aid that they provide to Ukraine will also be counted. Even in 1924, the Russian military budget at the peak of costs for the war not much, but exceeded the costs for the defense of all European countries, if we consider the purchasing power parity, which is fair. As you may remember from my video, the production of weapons in Europe is much more expensive. But now, even if the Europeans do not reach the 5% bar, it is still possible to expect at least a double military potential, and Putin cannot even dream of getting on this bar. This is not taken into account by the USA with their trillion-dollar military budget, which is also record-breaking. Again, Europeans will be able to accumulate weapons produced for new means, and Putin will continue to throw almost all the weapons produced into the meat of the war. Every day, as the war continues, the retreat of Russia from Europe increases, and together with it, the confidence of Europeans in the face of Russian aggression grows. What exactly does not grow is the influence of Russia in neighboring countries. Kazakhstan, which the Russian troops saved some 4 years ago in quotes from the revolution, allows itself such Russophobic outbursts, as it is called on Russian propaganda television, as the transition from Cyrillic to Latin and the printing of history textbooks where it is said about Russian colonial politics. Armenia threatens to leave the de facto headquartered Russia and, in fact, stopped its participation there. This organization turned out to be absolutely useless, except for suppressing protests in the countries of the participants. The Armenian authorities rightly accuse Russia of not fulfilling the contract on the purchase of weapons and instead appeal for help to France, which was called to be a new guarantee of the security of Armenia. This, by the way, caused a serious conflict between France and Azerbaijan, including the support of the latest separatism in the French New Caledonia. In general, a crazy interesting story. This is not our profile, but again, this is happening with the complete absence of the voice of Russia, which cannot intervene in the situation in any way. Since all resources are being consumed by the war with Ukraine, well, the same Azerbaijan, which, after the Second Karabakh War, is associated with Russia and the Allied Treaty, as a result, throws out of the country Russian-Ukrainian cooperation, arrests Wagner and propagandists of the satellite, and also supplies Ukraine with humanitarian aid, and speaks not only humanitarian. Aliyev himself accepts Ukrainian chevrons as a gift and calls on Ukrainians to fight with Russia for territorial integrity, giving his own example. And we remember that the restoration of full control over Karabakh demonstrated a complete helplessness in the destruction of Russia. Again, without a relative moral assessment of what happened. By the way, this helplessness was fully demonstrated in the Middle East. The Russian VKS group in Syria tried to prevent the offensive. The enemy of Assad, which in a matter of days led to the overthrow of the Syrian regime. However, instead of the planned air bombs guided by GPS, which apparently are all going to strike Ukrainian civilians, Russian planes in Syria have used a tactic of 10 years ago by throwing out the uncontrolled Chugunya, which could hardly be hit, by the rapidly advancing column of the opposition, maximum on hospitals on the uncontrolled territory by which the Russian aviation, as usual, struck. In recent years, Syria has become a reference for generals who demonstrated total incompetence in Ukraine. And of course, there could be no speech about the transfer of additional forces. So here too, Russia turned out to be a helpless observer. I will not say who, because I do not like to use beep practices as an insult, and soon it was necessary to lead its troops from the outskirts of the country to the base on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, which still exists. On bird rights, simply because the new Syrian government needs at least some kind of counterweight, as it seems to them. Hostile-minded Israel. When the uprising began on the coast in the past of the pro-Assad Alawite minority, overgrown in rubble, the Russian military could not influence the situation. H-Mamam Air Base was under the guise of the artillery of the government troops. Insurgents of yesterday who were bombarded by the Russians for 10 years. Even the Al-Alawite refugees had to be evicted from the territory of the airbase. The Syrian authorities asked for it persistently when the order was restored on the coast, hinting that in case of what, they might return to the question of the status of the Russian bases. And in general, the situation is when Russian columns check on the blog posts of armed people who not long before Russian soldiers were considered bearded people. I will not say what they were called again, you cannot call anything but humiliation. In the same way, Russia did not move a finger during the 12-day war of Israel against Iran. The fact that the Russian authorities realized their own weakness in the Middle East is seen from the fact that the Treaty on Strategic Partnership with Iran, signed a few months before the war, did not include points of mutual assistance in the event of an attack on one of the sides, unlike the same treaty with North Korea, because Putin was required by the soldiers of the People's Republic of Korea to fight off the Kurdish region. By the way, the situation when part of Russia is occupied by an enemy country has been unprecedented since 1945. This, by the way, was the second case in history when a non-nuclear power invaded the territory of nuclear power. The previous one happened during the Falkland War when Argentina decided to check the rumbling British Empire for strength. But unlike Russia, the British took out the invaders from the Falkland Islands without resorting to the help of foreign allies. Of course, Russia, which was not even able to fight off the Kurdish region without external help, was not able to influence the Iranian-Israeli conflict, even if the Ukrainian army was not completely involved in the war with Ukraine. They could not fight such a competent modern aviation as the Sahel Air Force. There was no serious supply of weapons to Iran either. The Islamic Republic did not receive any Su-35 fighters or any number of ZRKs that could, if not to be broken, change the course of the air war over Iran. Russia, which due to the loss of the air defense from Ukrainian strikes, breaks even the contracts agreed long ago on the supply of S-400s, for example from India, could not strengthen the nominal ally, although the need for this was obvious after the previous strikes of Israel on Iran in October last year. Times of the ships' war have passed, when Israel was forced to conclude peace, including under the threat of a direct Soviet intervention. Russia has not managed to restore influence in the Middle East during the USSR, and along with the remnants of this influence, the last claims for the status of a superpower have gone away. Well, if you need the formal criteria of a superpower, then watch my recent video about Admiral Kuznetsov, the last Russian aircraft carrier, so to speak, which was finally decided to be sent to the trash. Russian court analysts can continue to talk about the existential conflict with the West, but again, Russia can continue to wage a war with Ukraine and a secret war with Europe, only while the West itself allows it. It is very good that in the middle of not only pro-Ukrainian dissenters, but also journalists from the leading publications to the yellow press are those who have the courage to shout, "The king is naked." Thank them for that. We also remember the cockroach, of course. We are strong when we see the truth that in front of us. No, not a cockroach. Here in Belarus, but a moth, and this moth is weaker every day. But this moth takes people's lives. Therefore, it is time to crush it as widely as possible. Well, Michael Nacke was with you, and see you soon. All the best. Bye.